To rescue her brother, she becomes the bride of a heartless millionaire. Those were the exact words she whispered to herself while standing in the marble lobby he owned, but she didn't belong in. Her shoes were still damp from the snow outside, leaving small marks on a floor polished enough to reflect people who never looked down. She held a contract she hadn't agreed to sign, a price she couldn't afford to refuse, and a silence that weighed heavier than the debt pressing on her family. And as the elevator doors opened, she realized the deal wasn't the only thing waiting for her. Her name was Mara Dalton, a 26-year-old line cook from the south side of Chicago, raised in a neighborhood where every cracked sidewalk held a story, and every spare dollar had a job long before it reached a wallet. She grew up in a narrow brick apartment with thin walls, louder neighbors, and a mother who used to say, "Hold your ground, even when it shakes beneath you." It wasn't a quote from anyone famous, just something her mother repeated whenever rent went up, or the bus was late, or life offered more grit than mercy. Mara built her adulthood around that creed. Before dawn each morning, she tied back her hair, counted the loose bills in her apron pocket, and walked to the diner, where she flipped eggs for people who barely noticed her, except to complain their tap water wasn't cold enough. Her whole world ran on thrift. $4 meals she stretched into 2, secondhand coats, and the quiet skill of pretending she didn't hear the restaurant manager gossiping about layoffs. Her younger brother, Evan, was the reason she pushed harder than exhaustion allowed. Bright, reckless, and always convinced he could outrun consequences, he'd fallen into debt with the kind of people who didn't send reminders, only threats. Mara, older by 3 years and steadier by nature, became his shield long before she was ready for the weight. Their mother had died when Mara was 19, their father long gone before that. She had no inheritance, no safety net, no relatives with spare rooms or spare cash. What she did have was routine, grit, and a belief that small acts, packed lunches, honest work, paying bills on time, could keep life from collapsing. But stability is fragile when the world doesn't care about your creed. The diner cut her hours. Evan's debt collectors became bolder. Mara found herself counting coins at midnight, wondering how many shifts she could pick up before her hands started shaking at the grill. Her pride kept her from borrowing, and her fear kept her from ignoring the situation. She stood between her brother and danger, with nothing but determination and the last thread of family loyalty. She didn't know yet that the path to saving him would lead straight into the world of the man who had everything except mercy. Mara's fragile hope arrived in the form of a single, unexpected phone call from Brookstone Finance, a corporate lender far above anything she'd ever dealt with. Evan had insisted he could negotiate his own repayment plan, but the collectors had already passed his case upward, and someone from the company requested an in-person meeting with her, not him. At first, Mara thought it was a mistake. People like her didn't get meetings in downtown towers, but desperation can make anything look like a lifeline. If she could explain, if she could promise steady payments, if she could just convince them her brother wasn't running, maybe they would extend the deadline and halt the threats. She practiced her pitch while packing diner sandwiches into foil, rehearsing how to sound responsible, trustworthy, composed. She believed she could fix this because she had to. If this opportunity failed, Evan would face consequences she didn't dare imagine. She could lose her apartment, her job, her fragile sense of control, and the $4 she kept tucked away in her wallet, a symbol of her independence, would mean nothing in the world she was about to step into. Everything depended on one meeting she couldn't afford to get wrong. Mara arrived at the Brookstone Tower 20 minutes early, clutching the folder of payment plans she'd drafted on her kitchen table. The lobby felt colder than outside, the kind of cold that came from air conditioning meant for people who never worried about electric bills. She checked in politely, tried to steady her breathing, and followed the receptionist's instructions to the 29th floor. The meeting room was glass-walled and bright, overlooking a city she'd only ever seen from bus windows. 3 executives sat at the table, none of whom looked like they had the time or interest to know her name. 1. A man in a slate suit gestured for her to sit, but didn't bother with introductions. She'd barely begun explaining Evan's situation when the slate suit man cut her off. "We already spoke to your brother," he said flatly. "He claimed you would be paying his balance in full today." Mara froze. "That's not true. He wouldn't say that. We agreed." He slid a paper across the table with her name typed neatly at the top. "He authorized withdrawal from an account under your signature." Her chest tightened. The signature wasn't hers, but it looked close enough to fool a stranger. Evan had panicked, she realized. He'd tried to fix things on his own, and in doing so, made everything worse. "I didn't sign this," she said, voice trembling. The man only shrugged. "Whether you did or didn't, the balance is due. Today." When she tried to explain further, one of the executives chuckled quietly, as if watching someone audition for pity. The humiliation hit instantly, hot, burning, impossible to swallow. She felt small, outnumbered, and exposed in a room designed to make people like her feel powerless. Then came the final blow. "If you can't pay," the slate suit man said, "your brother's account will move to legal escalation. We've already prepared the transfer. Consider this meeting a courtesy." A courtesy. A lie disguised as an opportunity. She hadn't been called here to negotiate. They'd called her to watch her fail, to confirm she had nothing to offer. Her hope collapsed in a single breath. As Mara stood to leave, one executive whispered to another, not quietly enough, "Why do they even try? They don't belong in rooms like this." The words followed her into the hallway, sharp as broken glass, cutting deeper with each step. And someone else heard them too, someone who wasn't supposed to. Adrian Hale had not planned to overhear anything that morning. Keats stepped out of his office only because his assistant insisted he review a contract in person before leaving for a board briefing. Brookstone Tower was partly his family's building, his empire in polished steel, and Adrian moved through its floors with the practiced indifference of someone born into ownership. He paused near the hallway when he heard raised voices, not loud, but strained in a way that drew attention. A woman's voice, controlled, shaking, trying not to break. Adrian turned just enough to see her. Mara Dalton stood outside the glass meeting room, clutching a folder to her chest like armor. Her shoulders were stiff, her jaw set, but her eyes were burning with something he recognized instantly, someone trying not to be humiliated. The executives inside were still talking, laughing in low tones, as if the meeting were an inconvenience rather than a crisis for the person who'd just walked out. Adrian had seen this before. People being dismissed, talked over, written off. Boardrooms thrived on it. It rarely interested him. He was trained to focus only on numbers. But something about her expression made him linger. His assistant, Daniel, followed his gaze. "She's nobody," Daniel murmured. "Just a debtor's relative. Her brother's a complete mess. They brought her in to hear the terms, but I guess she didn't like what she heard." Adrian's eyes stayed on Mara. "They brought her in knowing she couldn't fix it?" Daniel shrugged. "Standard procedure." But Adrian knew that was a lie. Standard procedure did not include dragging someone to the 29th floor to publicly remind them they were powerless. That was someone's idea of entertainment or punishment, or both. He watched Mara move toward the elevators, her pace determined, even though every step looked heavy. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She didn't collapse the way most people did when confronted with financial ruin on this scale. She walked as if clinging to something invisible. Dignity, maybe. Or the last shred of pride that humiliation hadn't stripped from her. Adrian felt something shift inside him. Not sympathy, exactly, but curiosity edged with irritation. His company, his building, his employees, humiliating people under his name without purpose or profit irritated him to his core. "Find out who she is," he said quietly. Daniel blinked. "Why? She's no one." Adrian cut him off with a sharp look. Everyone is someone to somebody. And as the elevator doors closed around Mara Dalton, Adrian Hale realized he wasn't letting this go. Not yet. Mara reached the ground floor with a single goal: get outside before the pressure in her chest shattered into tears she refused to show. She moved quickly across the marble lobby, past people in tailored coats and expensive shoes, trying to breathe through the humiliation still echoing in her ears. She was 2 steps from the exit when a voice called her name. "Ms. Dalton." She froze. A few heads turned. Not many, but enough to make her pulse spike. She swallowed hard and turned to see the man from the hallway. Tall, composed, wearing a charcoal coat that probably cost more than her monthly rent. He walked toward her with calm assurance, the kind that came from never being told no. "I'm Adrian Hale," he said simply. The name meant nothing to her, but the way others in the lobby straightened when he passed said everything. "I think there's been a misunderstanding upstairs," Adrian continued, stopping a polite distance away. His tone was neutral, but firm, controlled in a way that made people listen. "You were not treated appropriately. I'd like to offer assistance." Mara stiffened. "I don't need charity." A few people glanced over. Adrian didn't. "It isn't charity," he said. "Your brother's case is tangled in—" He hesitated, choosing a word that wouldn't openly insult his own staff. "Questionable handling. I can correct that." Mara shook her head. "I don't know who you are, but that's not how this works. They made it clear. The balance is due. Today." "Not anymore," Adrian replied. Then he did something that made time slow. He stepped forward and addressed the security guard nearby, loud enough for others to hear. "Please note," he said, "that Ms. Dalton is my guest. She is free to access all Brookstone offices without restriction." Several people turned. Whispers rose. Even the receptionist straightened, as if she'd been caught doing something wrong. Mara felt heat rise to her face. "Why would you say that? You don't even know me." "True," he admitted. "But I know what happened upstairs was unjust, and I don't allow unfairness under my name." The word "my" finally clicked. Mara studied his face, steady, composed, unbothered by the small audience forming around them. "You're in charge here," she said quietly. Adrian gave a small nod. Not proud. Not smug, simply honest. But his public declaration had consequences. People stared. Staff murmured. The power dynamic shifted so visibly that even Mara felt the current change. She hated how exposed she felt, but she also hated that a part of her needed this lifeline. Adrian held out a simple offer. "Let me fix what they broke," he said. And though she didn't answer yet, the building had already heard him, and nothing would be the same after that. Adrian escorted Mara back upstairs, not to the glass meeting room where she'd been humiliated, but to a smaller executive office where a woman in her 60s waited behind a mahogany desk. Evelyn Hale, his mother and chairwoman of the Hale family board, looked up from a stack of documents with the kind of calm that made people brace themselves. Adrian rarely requested private meetings without notice. Evelyn immediately sensed something was off. "Who is this?" she asked, eyes narrowing slightly at Mara's worn coat and the folder clutched in her hands. "A guest," Adrian replied. "One who was mistreated by our staff." Evelyn's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to. "Mistreated how?" Adrian explained briefly, his tone clipped but controlled. Mara listened, feeling strangely out of place, yet unable to look away from Evelyn's sharp gaze. An assessment she wasn't used to receiving, but recognized from years of dealing with customers who judged without knowing. When Adrian finished, Evelyn folded her hands neatly. "So you intervened publicly," she said to him, not her. "In the lobby, in front of employees." "I corrected an injustice," he replied. "And you brought her here," Evelyn continued, voice turning cool, "because you believe she deserves additional protection?" Mara stepped forward before Adrian could answer. "I don't need protection," she said firmly. "Only fairness. My brother made a mistake, but I came to take responsibility. I wasn't looking to cause trouble." Evelyn's eyes flicked to her, studying, weighing. "People in difficult circumstances always say that," she said. "But this building is not a charity hall. My son's impulse to fix things often creates new problems." Mara felt heat rise in her chest. "Your staff laughed at me. They accused me of lying. They tried to use me to scare my brother into paying money he doesn't have. That isn't policy. That's cruelty." Evelyn's gaze sharpened like a blade. "And you believe raising your voice at me will solve your debt?" Mara didn't flinch. "I'm not raising my voice. I'm standing my ground. That's all I have left." Adrian looked between them, his mother's unyielding authority on one side, Mara's quiet defiance on the other. Two worlds colliding in a room too small to hold the difference between them. Evelyn finally leaned back. "Adrian," she said, "your heart is generous, but this," she gestured subtly at Mara, "is not your responsibility. Do not take on burdens that do not belong to you," he answered without hesitation. "Sometimes responsibility finds us." The room fell silent, and for the first time, Evelyn's composure shifted, not breaking, but cracking just enough to show disapproval mixed with something more dangerous. Concern, not for Mara, but for her son's judgment. The clash ended not with agreement, but with a line drawn sharply between power and conviction, one neither side could ignore. The moment the office door closed behind them, the hallway felt too bright, too exposed, too heavy with everything unsaid. Mara walked a few steps ahead, her pace clipped and tense, while Adrian followed with calm precision that only irritated her more. When they reached a quiet alcove near the elevators, she stopped abruptly. "You shouldn't have done that," she said, turning on him. Her voice shook, not with fear, but with anger she'd been holding in for too long. Adrian looked genuinely confused. "Done what?" "Dragged me into your mother's office like some project. Spoken for me. Announced to an entire lobby that I'm your guest. I didn't ask for any of it." He studied her for a moment. "You were publicly humiliated. I corrected it. That's all." "That's not all," she shot back. "You turned me into a spectacle. People stared like I was something you picked up out of pity. I wasn't pitying you." "Then what was it?" Mara demanded. "Some powerful man reflex? You see something broken and assume you're the only one who can fix it." He flinched, not visibly, but enough that she sensed she'd struck a nerve. "Mara," he said quietly, "I acted because what happened to you was wrong. And I can handle being wronged," she countered. "I've handled worse. What I can't handle is being treated like I'm helpless." Silence stretched between them. People passed by, executives, assistants, interns, but none slowed. It was a public hallway that felt like a private standoff. Adrian folded his hands behind his back, the posture of someone trying very hard to stay composed. "Would you rather I had done nothing?" She hesitated. The honest answer, no, was harder to admit when pride was all she had left. "I would rather you'd asked." His jaw tightened slightly. "You were walking away. And you looked?" "Don't say I looked fragile," she warned. "I wasn't going to," he replied. "I was going to say you looked alone." That made her breath catch, not because it was an insult, but because it was true. Mara looked away. "You don't know anything about my life." "I'd like to," Adrian said. Not soft, not hopeful, just factual. She exhaled sharply, trying to steady herself. "Well, let me tell you one thing. In my family, we have a rule. Hold your ground. It means we don't let people rescue us just because they can." "And in mine," Adrian answered, "we solve problems before they destroy anything." Two creeds, two worlds, neither yielding. The elevator pinged behind them, but neither moved. Their argument wasn't loud, but it left a mark. Raw, unpolished, honest. A collision of pride and principle that made one thing painfully clear. Helping her wouldn't be simple. And accepting help might be even harder. The next morning, Mara expected silence. Maybe an email from Brookstone Finance stating her brother's account had been reviewed or escalated. What she didn't expect was a call from Adrian himself. "Ms. Dalton," he said, voice steady, "your brother's case has complications. To resolve them, I need your cooperation on a matter connected to the Hale Foundation." She frowned. "Why me?" "Because your brother's debt was wrapped into a community grant program with irregular bookkeeping. The foundation is auditing it, and I need someone from the affected side to assist. You're the only person in your family who understands the situation well enough to help fix it." Mara almost laughed. "You want me to consult? I'm a line cook." "You're also the only one who has been honest with me," he replied. "Meet me at the foundation at noon." She wanted to refuse. Pride said to refuse. But Evan's future dangled by a thread, and if this partnership could help straighten the mess, she had to try. The Hale Foundation occupied a sleek, modern suite overlooking the river. Inside, walls held framed photos of charity events, board meetings, and philanthropic achievements. Mara felt underdressed in her thrift store blouse, but Adrian greeted her with a nod that suggested she belonged there more than she believed. He introduced her to Lydia Boone, the foundation's operations manager, a sharp, efficient woman who clearly didn't understand why a diner cook was involved. "You'll both be reviewing documentation tied to the South Ridge Youth Grant," Adrian explained. "Funds went missing. Loans were pulled from the wrong accounts, including your brother's." Lydia shot Adrian a look. "And you want her to verify records?" Adrian's expression cooled. "Yes." And just like that, the roles were set. All afternoon, Mara and Lydia sorted through spreadsheets, emails, old grant applications, and financial trails that twisted like tangled roots. Lydia was skeptical at first, but Mara wasn't intimidated by paperwork. Years of budgeting penny by penny made her surprisingly sharp with numbers. "Here," Mara said at one point, pointing to a discrepancy. "This withdrawal wasn't authorized. It's copied from a different form." Lydia blinked. "She's right." Adrian glanced over. "Good eye." Mara didn't respond, but something warm flickered beneath her ribs. Not gratitude, validation. Hours slipped by. They solved problems. They debated. They clashed. They cooperated. By evening, a pattern emerged in the corrupted accounts. Evidence that someone inside Brookstone had redirected debt cases to inflate collection bonuses. Evan wasn't a failure. He was a target. Mara looked at Adrian, breath unsteady. "This wasn't our mistake." "No," he agreed. but it's now our fight. Suddenly, they weren't opponents. They weren't charity and resentment. They were two people forced into the same storm, standing on the same fragile ground, whether they liked it or not. They worked late into the night. Long after the foundation staff had gone home and the city outside the windows turned into a glittering stretch of sleepless lights. Stacks of documents sat between them, some annotated, some flagged, others marked with evidence of the internal scheme they were slowly uncovering. What had begun as an audit now felt like peeling back layers of a deeper rot. Around 9, Mara leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temples. "Whoever did this," she said softly, "they used families like mine because we don't have lawyers. We don't have leverage. No one would question a forged signature if the person behind it was already struggling." Adrian set down the file he'd been reading. "People assume power protects you from being used," he replied. "But it just hides the traps better." She studied him, unsure what he meant. "Traps? You're a Hale. You run half this building. What could possibly trap you?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved toward the window, hands in his pockets, looking out at the river splitting the city in two. Glamour on one bank, exhaustion on the other. "My father built this empire on image," Adrian finally said. "Every decision I make is watched. Every mistake is amplified. Every act of compassion is treated as weakness. I'm expected to be untouchable, cold." A faint, bitter smile touched his mouth. "Sometimes I think I'm not a person to them, just a role." Mara's first instinct was disbelief. But the emptiness in his tone wasn't performative. It was the sound of someone who'd been taught never to falter. "That's not the same as poverty," she said gently. "No," he agreed, "but it's its own kind of cage." She let the words settle. The room felt different now. Quieter, heavier, but honest in a way that stripped away the distance money usually created. Mara had never considered that someone with everything could still feel cornered. "My family expects me to uphold the Hale name at any cost," he continued. "Yours taught you to hold your ground. Neither of us can walk away from what we've inherited." Mara exhaled. "I guess we're both stuck following rules we didn't ask for." "For now," he said. Then he turned, leaning against the window frame. "But tonight changed something." He nodded toward the scattered documents. "We're not victims of this. We're the ones uncovering it." The realization pressed between them. Not dramatic, not spoken, but shared. They were both trapped, and neither could escape without the... For the first time, they weren't on opposite sides of a problem. They were on the same side of the truth. The next morning, Adrian called an emergency briefing on the 32nd floor, an open conference space lined with glass and filled with managers, auditors, and executives who'd once dismissed Mara without a glance. She stood beside him, not behind, holding the file that contained every forged signature, every manipulated withdrawal, every deceit that had targeted families like hers. When Adrian spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone who no longer cared about maintaining a spotless image. "These accounts," he announced, "were altered internally. The fault lies not with debtors, but with our own staff." A ripple of shock spread through the room. Mara stepped forward and placed the evidence onto the center table. "This wasn't a mistake," she said steadily. "It was deliberate, and it hurt people who trusted this company." Executives exchanged uneasy glances. Ohms shifted in their seats. A few who had mocked her the day before couldn't meet her eyes now. Adrian looked directly at them. "Effective immediately, investigations begin. Those responsible will be removed." The power dynamic had flipped entirely. Mara, once humiliated in their glass meeting room, now stood as the voice exposing their wrongdoing. And Adrian, the heartless millionaire, backed her without hesitation. For the first time, the room listened. 2 weeks later, Mara found herself standing once again in the marble lobby of Brookstone Tower, the same place where her shoes had left damp marks and her dignity had nearly been crushed under polished floors. Only this time she wasn't clutching a folder or bracing for humiliation. She was simply waiting. The building felt different. Or maybe she did. The investigation had concluded. The employees responsible were removed. Evan's debt was cleared entirely, marked as fraudulent activity. And Mara, to her own disbelief, had been formally thanked in the Foundation's report for her indispensable cooperation. But what mattered most was something quieter. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the same $4 she had kept tucked away for years, her tiny symbol of independence. Once it represented the last bit of control she had over her life. Now it felt lighter, like it no longer needed to stand guard for her. Adrian approached from across the lobby, dressed simply, no entourage following him. He stopped beside her, offering no formal greeting, just a nod of acknowledgement. "It's done," he said. "I know," she replied. "Evan's safe, my family's safe." He hesitated. "Thank you for standing your ground." Mara almost smiled. "Thank you for letting me." There was no grand gesture, no softened confession, no romance lingering in the space between them. Only mutual respect, earned through conflict, truth. And one long night neither of them had expected. She held up the $4, letting the light catch it. "I used to think this meant I was on my own," she said. "Now, I think it just means I can choose who I stand beside." Adrian nodded. "Then keep choosing well." Mara slipped the money back into her pocket, not as a shield anymore, but as a reminder of how far she had come. She walked toward the exit. Adrian didn't follow, but she didn't need him to. Outside, the city moved with its usual noise and grit, but for the first time, it didn't feel like it was pushing her down. It felt like it was making space. Some stories don't end with love. They end with understanding. Mara walked into a world that tried to shrink her, and she walked out of it, carrying her dignity, her courage, and a new sense of what strength really means. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, like the people who survive more than anyone ever sees. If this story made you pause, made you breathe a little deeper, or reminded you of your own quiet resilience, consider joining us for the next one. If this story made you feel something, like and subscribe.